Good morning. We'll be starting up here in about 2 minutes or so after the top of the hour. We'll give folks 1 more minute to log in. While we're doing that, you may want to go ahead and set up so you can answer the questions via poll EV, and also there is a handout. Open up your chat pod, and that'll be available. We'll repost that again after we get started for those who come in a few minutes. There's the beat. Let's start this show. Good morning, and welcome to the last of our summer foundational or Y webinars. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York State LTAP Center of the Cornell Local Roads program. I want to welcome you to this session, and we'll talk more about what we're doing for next year and on some of our fall training that's related to snow and ice. Today, we're going to be doing an overview of snow and ice issues. Again, just giving you some foundational concepts to help you for this fall. If you haven't thought about these things, now's the time to think about it. And again, we are going to be doing polls via Poll Everywhere or pollev.com/DavidOrP. If you open up your chat pod, that will show up in there. And we, just to illustrate this, down the bottom, you should see a chat button. Pull that up. For those who are just getting in now, you should be able to see that. You can raise your hand. We may actually do that at some times. You can do Q&A. That's how you'll input things to us if you have any questions. And maybe answering a couple of the questions that I have. This course or webinar is worth 1 professional development hour here in New York State, but it is only the person who is registered who gets the credit. Okay, and you do need to stay on for pretty much the entire time. It counted as a course for those who need them. I just finished mine. I'm now re-registered for 3 more years myself. If you are from another state, you'll need to check with your LTAP center. We're going to talk a lot about New York weather, but a lot of this stuff is translatable across anywhere where we get lots and lots of snow. So we'll start with a little bit of a welcome, and also to make sure everybody's up to speed on Poll Everywhere and some of the inputs. And again, it's pollev.com/DavidOrPE. And I just realized, I wonder if I cleared everything. I don't remember if I cleared it. Oh, it's going to make me log in. Okay. We're going to actually shut down for just a second. So you get to see my background pictures, because it's easier to log in from here. And I have no idea why it's making me log in, but we'll take care of that. And I won't count that against you. Okay, and then back over to PowerPoints. And we go up 5, and we go 4, and we have our welcome. And there we go. It's working. Woohoo! I did clear it, but I must have needed to re-log in. So let's let everybody log in and give me your answers. Who do you work for? Do you work for a town, a county, a village, state or federal, tribal, consultant, contractor? You're an honest person and you work for the weekend. Okay. Okay, so quite a variety of folks, actually quite a few city folks I see. That's good. Okay. And we have a few folks who are honest and work for the weekend. Okay. That's good. That actually helps me quite a bit. What is your job? Are you an administrator, highway superintendent, or DPW commissioner, an engineer, looking for your PDHs? I see a lot of folks doing that. Are you from the field crew, supervisors, things like that? Actually get out there and get your boots muddy. Supervisor for the town or a board member, or none of the above. If you put in none of the above, do me a favor and throw in your title in the Q&A pod so I know what that none of the above is, because there's a few of them that have marked none of the above. I'm just curious. And again, if you can't do poll EV, you can put the answer in the Q&A pod. I can take that into account. So I see I've got a B in there, which means it's you're the highway superintendent of DPW. Yeah. Okay. And then finally, where are you from? This is a map of New York State. You just click on where you're from. If you're not from New York State, you can sort of click near the edge or outside. We'll see if we have anybody swimming today. Usually get 1 or 2 people swimming in Lake Ontario, but no, not today. So concentrated suburban areas, Albany, Binghamton, downstate, quite a few, a couple who are all across the border in Connecticut. Okay. Okay. And again, I see that someone put in there, they're from Auburn. Okay. Hello, Bill. Good morning. Okay. Now, this is the last of our summer series of webinars. But as we came out of COVID, we started saying we're going to keep doing these. So we're going to do the full cycle. It's a 2-year cycle and see how it works and revisit everything. So for next year, you can see there's 24 webinars. A lot of them are repeats from this year. I'll admit that, about half. Because they're important enough, like basics of a good road, that we just want to do them again every single year. But a few are going to be new, such as bridge basics, some information on guardrail for those outside of New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. But these will be starting up again after the bridge conference. Watch this space. We'll be putting information out about the dates and the times. They'll still be on Tuesdays at 9 a.m. That part won't change. But we're going to take a hiatus on these during our in-person workshop season, which starts up right after Labor Day. Next week, of course, is the County Highway Superintendent's meeting in Clayton, New York. We don't want to interfere with that. So today we're going to be doing a snow and ice overview. And again, there is a handout. If you open up your chat pod, you can download the handout. It outlines what we're going to talk about today, lists the webinar topics for next year, so you have them, and gives you some references and resources you can use as you're setting up for this winter, which, you know, you're looking outside, it's rainy, it's humid. We do need the rain. But it's going to be here sooner than you think. We need to be planning now. So we're going to be talking a little bit about weather, level of service, and that's actually a very important thing to set. The materials that we use, the equipments that we've got, maybe setting up of the routes and some of the things you've got to do on those routes, and setting up the equipment and materials that work with them, and of course, dealing with emergencies. All of this, of course, will lead to policy setting, which will end the session talking about that, and a few, of course, PDA questions. Now, if you read the description, we said we would talk about why snow and ice is critical, but using one word. And if you do more than one word, it's going to show up with different spots. So one word, if you had to pick one word, why is snow and ice control? Why do we have that as a critical activity for highway and public works departments across New York State? Safety. Ooh, yeah, I was hoping safety would show up. Danger. Accident prevention. Yeah, okay. That's good. So far, we're all focused on accidents and safety and stuff like that. And I'm not arguing that isn't the number one thing we're going to think about. Efficiency. Yes. Okay. Something to think about. Okay. Accessibility, mobility, especially in the winter, that's critical. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Safety is critical. The safety of the traveling public, but we also have safety of our own people. But then really, when you think about it, snow and ice is critical for 3 things, one of which we don't always think about if we're doing our job right. Safety is number 1. I'm not going to ever argue against that. But good snow and ice control is important for mobility. It's important for community. It's important for commerce. It's important for getting kids to school on the buses, which for athletic things started this week across the state. So we have to balance those two. And at the same time, we do need to think about the environment. We need to use the right amount of materials to keep things safe in commerce, but not so much that we create salt pollution or we do damage with the materials that we're putting down. And it's surprisingly, if we do that well, it actually helps us with cost. And of course, driving all of this underneath really is a cost issue. And how much do things cost? Now, what do we got to deal with? We did a thing on snow and ice strategy a lot earlier, but let's just ask the question again. What kinds of winter weather do we have to deal with? So, sleet? Well, okay, yeah, sleet's good. Ice storm? Icy? Ice, yeah, okay. Snow, I was waiting for snow. Yeah, snow is our most common winter weather activity. And we could get an ice storm out of it. It could be a blizzard. It could be that ugly mixture. It could be a black ice situation, which is a form of weather. We could get wind, which can lead to drifting and all kinds of fun stuff. And your area is going to be different than some others. And if you're in an urban area, you're going to have to deal with things in a different way. And of course, from a pavement maintenance standpoint, you're going to get freezing and thawing too with part of winter weather, which leads to other issues and another weatherman. And of course, you have to do it in all kinds of weather, light and dark. Yeah. As you're setting up your policies, think about what weather you commonly deal with and realize that every year is unique. There may be differences, just like every summer is unique. You know, we've been dry until last week. Now we're wet. Last summer, we were getting flooding. This summer, it's south of us down in Kentucky, where they're dealing with some major floods. So these things change, but there are patterns, there are climates that we can deal with. This is a map that shows the average amount of snowfall, and of course, that varies quite a bit. If you happen to be at the end of Lake Erie or the end of Lake Ontario, you know you get tons and tons of snow. There are places in New York State that average well over 200 inches of snow in the Tug Hill, Lewis County, over towards Cranberry Lake, places right on the end. Lake Ontario, by the way, gets more snow typically than Lake Erie because Lake Erie freezes. Though last year it didn't. So Lake Erie actually won the snowball contest, the way it goes. But there are winter weather patterns that we have to deal with. So let's just looking at New York State, most of our weather comes in not, let me make sure my pen's, oh, that's right, I got to restart the pen here. I'm going to skip slides here. Most of our weather patterns are coming from one of 3 or 4 places, mostly east to west. We can get weather coming in straight from the west. Those Alberta clippers that come in from Canada that are really cold. And if they come across the lake, we get lake effect. Okay. We get winds coming in, we get light amount of snow. And of course, we'll get weather coming off of the Gulf. It brings a lot of moisture. And if it meets up with cold weather coming in, we can get big, huge volumes of snow. But of course, everybody who's been here very long knows that other than the lake effect bands, one of our most interesting things we get are essentially hurricanes that come up from the south. They bring all that moisture with it. And when they come back around the backside, we get a northeast. Okay. The winds are out of the northeast because they're pulling into the low. And that's actually, we get huge volume of weather from that, huge volume. They're going to be different than what you have to deal with. These storms that come off the coast or up from the south, lots of moisture, heavy, wet snow. The drier snows we get when the weather's coming in straight across, going to be lighter. Can actually lead to black ice, but all of it comes back to the idea that we're going to have a level of service when we're all said and done. Okay. So what do I mean by level of service? Well, you need to figure out what level you want your roads to look like during, after, and of course, an hour or two after each storm. We need to set that level of service. What it really comes down to is how quickly and safely can we stop? Because we said safety was our #1 goal, right? Okay. Stopping distance on a roadway depends upon lots of conditions, including the vehicle, the operator of the vehicle, all kind of conditions. But from the standpoint of snow and ice, it really comes down to the ratio from normal stopping and dry conditions. It goes up as things change. So if you get a wet pavement, it goes up by about, 70%, not quite double. And by the way, when we design roads for weather like now in the summer, we're actually designing for those wet conditions. So we actually don't design for dry, we actually design stopping distances for wet conditions. But versus dry, it's about 70% more. We start getting a little slush, but it's not enough to create any bonding or ice. We've doubled that. Fresh sand on packed snow is also about double, interestingly enough. But of course, if it starts to turn, get soft, get loose, get a little bit of ice, it can get further and further. And by the time you get up to pure snowpack with no treatment, or worse, ice, your stopping distances are much, much greater. So for people to be safe, they have to slow down. But let's take advantage of the fact that we can. Raise your hand if you think the public slows down in the winter. Raise your hand if you think they actually slow down on average in the winter when it's snowing. Well, a few people do. Got 1, 2, okay. They slow down. Now, do they slow down enough? I don't think so. We tend to not want to slow down as much as we need to. If you do the calculations for ice, you probably need to go from 55, if you're in a rural area where that's the state speed limit, down under 20 or 30 miles an hour to have the same stopping distance. And of course, if you're tailgating, that could lead to some severe accidents. So let's talk about setting a goal for level of service. This is summer condition, okay? This is the road right next to where the guy who wrote over our class for this topic, snow and ice control, Dewey Angela, lived. It's right next to him. So he took this picture during the winter, actually, just to show you what things would look like that are bare. And there are people who think that's what the road should look like 24/7. Okay. Now, this would be what we might call close to bare. There's a little bit of ice along the edge. Some people don't even like this, but the reality is we have to set goals. We can't always have that high level of service. In a residential area like this particular one, this is probably a fine condition shortly after a storm or maybe an hour or two later. This is a little bit icy. Your stopping distance is probably going to be double, but you don't need it on every road, but this is probably unacceptable on your main roads, your arterial, Main Street, except during the height of the storm. And of course, during the storm, though, you might have whiteout conditions. It might be getting to the point where it's getting hard to see. You need to think about what's the level of service. If you're in Auburn, and I know Bill's on here today, and you're talking about maybe you're maintaining the state routes, the main roads through the city, what's your level of service before, during, and after the storm? How quickly do you want it to get it to be bare ice, or bare road, excuse me. So going backwards, when do you want the road to look like this? When do you want it to look like this? When do you want it to look like this? You need to set your own policy, and don't have the same policy for every single road in the community. Probably a few hours after the storm is one thing, but right afterwards, this is probably okay. I hate to say it on a residential street. Again, looking at money, budget, safety, environment, all balanced together. Okay. Now, some storms are big enough where you may not be able to keep up, and you have to decide, hey, we need to pull people back. We need to cancel school. We need to let people know it's really unsafe to be out there. So the question is, do you have a level of service set for snow and ice? Yes, in writing. Yes, in your head. I need to develop one. No, we don't have one. And if you have something else that you're doing, let me know by putting in none of the above and then putting it in the Q&A, what your none of the above means. Okay, what is your level of service that you've got? Again, you can put that in the Q&A. And again, if you don't have access to the Q&A, you can put it into the poll everywhere. Put it into the Q&A. I can look at it. Okay. Okay, so about a third of you have a policy in writing. This is a great time to look at changing that policy. Some of you have it in your head, and that might be okay, but what happens when you leave? Okay, so that's something I want you to think about. You know you need to develop one. This is a great time to do it. You can try it out, always change it. That's perfectly acceptable. Not having a level of service policy means you're going to be at the whims of people yelling at you, phoning you, or maybe even the elected officials who are going to demand something that may be unrealistic. And if you have none of the above, again, I was hoping to see if there's other ideas people have for level of service, because there may be other things we could do. And of course, if you have a contract with the state, or if you're a town or village or city with a county, you might have a level of service they want you to meet, and that can create its own issues as well. So one way to think about level of service, if you haven't done this, get yourself a map. This is the city of Ithaca. This is from the data traffic viewer from state DOT. It's available on the web. And you can actually get a list of the federal aid roads that are in a community. So in this particular case, the red roads are the arterials by federal designation. The blue roads, excuse me, the green and the red roads are the main roads. The blue is the collectors, and then everything else is considered local. So obviously, if the city of Ithaca is setting a policy, they may want to say, okay, the green roads are the most important, Route 13, Route 79, we're going to give them the highest level of service. The roads that are red are going to get a secondary one, and then the blue is going to get third, and then finally, lastly, we have the low ones that we get to when we can, depending on schedule and budget. And by the way, I live on the street in the city of Ithaca, which has the last street to get plowed, which I'm okay with because I'm on a residential street and I can walk where I need to walk. I'm okay with that. Somebody has to be the last one plowed. Now, so one question I had for you, are there exceptions to just maybe following a classification and say, in this case, the federal aid? Is there an exception where you might want to bump a road up higher than it might have based upon its overall designation? Are there places you want to maintain the road at a higher level of service due to some critical nature? In Q&A, give me an example of where else we might bump up our level of service. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Bill. Road to the hospital. So up here in the Ithaca, the hospital is actually outside the city. Okay, it's up here outside the city. So even though that's not considered a green major arterial, it's a pretty important one. Okay, so that's something to think about. Roads to schools could be very important. Sometimes that road to school is important, not just because of getting kids to school, but also it might be an emergency access shelter in really cold weather, or if something breaks and you've got a problem. Okay. And you might want to change it for hills, and you might want to think about certain businesses that have to stay open. The road to your facility. Now, I see somebody here's a thing on snow fences. We'll talk a little bit, very briefly, about some alternative things towards the end of the hour. We have 1 hour, we can't cover a lot, but snow fences can help us setting a level of service or dealing with drifting. So it's not a bad thing to think about. Let's talk about materials. We don't just plow. And we'll talk about plowing in just a second, but plowing goes hand in hand with the materials. And so let's talk about the materials that we deal with. Abrasives is something we all have in our toolkit. We need to have in our toolkit, okay? Essentially, we're talking sand, okay? You want that sand to be able to handle the traffic that's on it. You don't want a soft sand. You need something with some grit to it to help give traffic temporary friction protection. And of course, if you have an unpaved road, you got to use sand, because if you use pure salt, you're going to create a problem. So in this particular case, we're going to have abrasives. We're going to add a little bit of salt to keep it from freezing, but very little. Don't add too much. Most people aren't added in a ratio of 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. You don't need that much. Actually, you can get away with 1 to 10 or even less, just enough to keep it from freezing, especially if you can keep it covered, as we see in the picture here. Yes, we should be covering our piles, and we'll talk about why here in just a minute. Another thing we have in our toolkit, almost all of us have salt in one form or another. Okay, the most common is sodium chloride, by far sodium chloride. In the Q&A, why is sodium chloride the most commonly used? Okay, why do we use sodium chloride the most? Even though, as you can see by this little temperature chart, it's not effective when you get too cold. Its realistic low temperature is probably 5 or less, or more, excuse me. Availability, which not just availability, it's price. Yeah, it's price, it's cost. So there are parts of the country where they can get good access to magnesium chloride, which, as you can see, you can get a little bit colder. And if you look at this chart, let me change my pen color so I can draw in here with the right color here. Yep, I got black. The effective temperature actually is a little bit higher than you might think. For sodium chloride, 5 degrees or lower, it's just not effective because you have such a high concentration to make it effective. You're pouring pure salt down there. You're going to get the same value of the grit of the salt as you're going to get from anything else. That's what these phase diagrams really show you, if you think about it, is how cold can you really use these materials. But you also got to look at this chloride percentage down here. For the calcium chloride to work at those really cold temperatures, you'd have to have 30% of your salt, snow, water mixture be salt, be the calcium chloride. Think how much you'd have to apply. It'd be an awful lot. It turns out as it dilutes, as we put it down, as it dilutes, they all track each other pretty closely up in here. So it turns out the starting works pretty well, but long term, any of them will work if they're used in the proper way, in the judicious way, and they stick where they're going to be. Okay? And you do have to be careful if you put too much, especially in the unpaved roads, and somebody you salt because they can thaw things. And if you've got cracks in the surface, it can freeze and thaw. Something to think about. Now, form doesn't have to be dry. It could be solid. You can do a liquid form. This is a liquid form being sprayed before a storm called anti-icing. It creates essentially a debonding layer, so ice doesn't bond to it on higher volume roadways. That may be something you want to add to your policy. You can pre-wet that salt. You can pre-wet it so it sticks, stays where it needs to be in the pile before you put it in the truck, or you can even put it on the truck and wet it literally as you're dropping it down. The idea of the pre-wetted is to make it sticky. If you take dry salt on dry pavement, this is research done out of Michigan, and throw it down just in the center, just literally drive down the center of the road, which obviously we can't completely do. But you drive down the center of the road, you're going to lose 30% of your material off the side of a 2-lane roadway where it's completely useless. It doesn't help anybody. The only thing it's going to do is damage plants just because it's dry. Okay. Now this is on dry pavement. Don't get quite as much spread when it's wet, but you still get quite a bit lost. If on the other hand, you just pre-wet the salt by, again, using a spinner or by putting it in the pile, look at that. Now you're only losing 2% or so. So again, pre-wetting can save you money, but you have to balance that with the cost of the equipment. But definitely pre-wetting is a really good idea, something you need to be thinking about to keep the salt where you want it to do the job of debonding so we don't create ice on the surface. And that's really the environmental issue that we need to be thinking about, is we want to use the salt or abrasives when they're needed, but we have to be careful that we just don't pour the salt and we damage the environment, either contaminating wells or by putting so much salt we damage the plants along the side of the roadway. So I mentioned I was going to talk about why we might want to cover our pile. So we now have 2 piles, okay? One pile is pure salt, 50-foot diameter pile, okay? The other pile is 50-foot diameter, it's sand, and it's got 10% salt. And again, you don't need much more than that to keep it from freezing. In fact, you can probably get away with 5%. But let's use 10% salt, okay? So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you think the salt pile with a 1-inch rainstorm has more salt runoff. Raise your hand if you think the salt has more runoff from a 1-inch rainstorm. Raise your hand. Okay. So a couple of you, 3 or 4 of you raised your hand. Okay, we got 6. Okay. Okay, now magically, watch this. My hands are up. It's gonna, all the hands are gonna be dropped here magically. Now raise your hand. So go ahead. Raise your hand now if you think the sand pile is going to have more salt runoff. The sand pile has more salt runoff. Let's see how many people think that is. Okay, so we got about the same number. Not surprising. Again, magically, they're all going to get cleared. Now, if you think they're pretty much equal, Raise your hand if you think the two are pretty much equal. Interesting. So we're getting votes coming in. Oh, got cleared. So it turns out, if you do the math, technically the salt produces a little more. Okay? And I need to change the pen color because if I write in black, you won't be able to read it. For the 50-foot diameter pile, 1 inch of rain, when it's all said and done, you're going to get 100 pounds. That's not a hashtag, that's a pound symbol of salt runoff, saturated water. With the same thing with the sand, with 10% salt, you get 96 pounds. Technically, there's more than the salt pile. Practically, they're the same. So that's why it's really important to actually cover your pile. And you've all seen this when you're driving along and you see a sand salt pile and there's that little bit of white running off. That's salt. It's not going to go to the road. Only thing it's going to be doing is be lost. Okay. So let's just see what you guys have in the way of policies. Okay. So you can click on any of these you want. So if you've got a salt policy, if you've got an abrasive policy, if you have treated salt, if you use liquids, if you have an anti-icing program, or if you've got some other techniques, like some people mentioned that they put up snow fences, put that down, click on other. But if you do other, please put it in the Q&A what that other means. Okay, let's see what we get here. Okay, so 7 of you have a salt policy. A couple of you have some abrasives as a primary thing. Okay, some you treat your salt, some use liquids, some use anti-icing. Okay, and of course I know that you're going to have different plans for different kinds of weather, so you may have to have some variation, because for instance you may not want to put liquids down in certain temperature regimes because it creates a thin layer of ice for a very short period of time. Some agencies don't want to do that, which is why some agencies like pre-wetted. Okay, and then the other, somebody put other, I'm assuming that might be something like snow fences or something like that. Okay, these go hand in hand with that level of service that we talked about. So you're developing your plan, you're putting everything together, and going back to our map, we can now start to create a plan. Of course, what I haven't talked about is the equipment we use to put all this material out and deal with it, because it's also going to affect our plan and our policy. Okay. And our equipment, it's a little better than this today. And of course, primarily we use trucks. Now, I'm going to just ask the question, how many trucks you have in your fleet? These are trucks for snow and ice. And I don't care if they're small trucks, medium, or even big trucks. We'll talk about the differences in the size of them. How many trucks do you have? Okay. Now, I'm asking you how many trucks you have. What haven't I asked you? In the Q&A, what haven't I asked you that's actually pretty dang important when it comes to the how many trucks you've got in your fleet? Do you have drivers to go with that truck? Do you have to deal with sidewalks? What kind of trucks do you have? Okay. And oh, by the way, how many miles of sidewalk or road or whatever trails do you have to maintain? If you've only got one truck, but you've only got 2 miles of road, you might be okay. But if you got 175 miles of road, you might need more than one truck. So it's really a balancing act. And of course, what you're maintaining. So with your fleet, it could even include snow blowers, which we didn't talk about, but what type of trucks do you have? What are the snow and ice attachments that go on that? i.e., do they plow and apply at the same time, or do they have separate applications? Not as common as it used to be, but they used to be a common thing. One group would plow, one would apply material. Do you have some kind of weather feedback system, either at the shop or in the truck itself? A lot of modern trucks actually have feedback that tell you the pavement temperature, which if I have to pick the one thing I want to hear, I want to know the pavement temperature. That's actually more critical to setting my material rate than is the air temperature. Okay. But these are all things we have to think about. Okay. Do you have wings on your truck? And if you have wings, do you run shoes on both the blade and on the wing? Okay, and then what kind of shoes and how much maintenance do you have? How long do they last? What kind of spreaders do you have? Do you have a spreader in front of the wheel? This is one where they actually bring the material to the front and they actually drop it in front of the back wheel. Okay, versus the more standard one that goes out the back. Each has its disadvantages and its advantages in terms of economics, cost, use, okay, things like that. What kind of spreader or rate control do you have in the truck? I actually like this picture. This is one that was it's in our snow and ice stack. And to show it to people who aren't familiar with snow and ice control stuff. And while most of us don't have this complicated level of system, a lot of us have things that are approaching this. And to realize that people who are driving those trucks, part of the reason we have a hard time getting them is may not be paying enough for people who are really doing a very important job for safety, commerce, and environment. And they have some pretty complicated stuff. They need to be trained. They need to do things quite often, do it really well. And of course, the machines need to be calibrated. So this all comes back to then knowing the equipment, the materials, our policy, our level of service, all of that together, including our hills, our drifting, parking, all that stuff, it's going to set our routes. So it's going to set the length of your routes, okay? Generally, for the same type of equipment, similar length, but of course, hills, shade, other things might change it. Time of day might make a difference. Do you have curves and hills? Well, it's already been mentioned in the Q&A, and it's really important to think about, okay? Shade can make a difference. You know, sun is really a great tool. It's wonderful in terms of clearing off the snow and the ice when you get a sunny day. And we do tend to actually get more sunny days in the winter than we do in the summer, at least here in Ithaca. But do you get drifting? Your road design, by the way, can actually affect drifting. We don't think about that, but if you get a deep ditch, it actually will tend to drop the snow out. And if the ditch is on the wrong side, it actually drops it in your roadway because it acts like a negative snow thing. And of course, do you have traffic? Do you have parking on street? Don't you have parking on street? And for those of you who are dealing with cities and even rural areas, do you have pedestrians and bicycles? And these all are things we need to thinking about as we're setting up our policies. Okay. So as you're putting your policy together, these are all things you're going to be thinking about. And of course, this leads to the spread rate and the patterns. So in the Q&A, what affects your spread rate and your pattern? Assuming you have you figure out what material you'd like to use. What affects your spread rate and your pattern? Which you guys put in the Q&A form. Speed of the truck, yep. So that needs to all be calibrated. The temperature, and again, the temperature that I care about is the pavement temperature. Though we always use air temperature as a surrogate, pavement temperature is really the key one, okay? The material that we're using, wet, not wet, things like that, okay? The weather is one of the key issues, sort of alluded to it, and that's the cycle time. Cycle time is absolutely critical. It's something we don't always think about. And the cycle time is how much material we need to put down so it doesn't get diluted by the weather itself. How big is the storm? How much dilution potential is there? When I'm setting cycle time, by the way, what do I need to include in my cycle time? So again, in the Q&A, what gets included in my cycle time? Let's see what people put here. Rate of snowfall, storm size, travel distance. Yep, travel distance, the equipment itself. Okay. Here's what I think about when I think of cycle time. Cycle time to me is the time to get in the truck, drive out, do the route, get back, reload the truck. That includes fuel, that includes whatever materials you're using, and includes resetting the user, the driver. They need a few minutes to reset themselves. You can't just plow all day. You've all tried that. It's not a fun thing to do. So there needs to be rest time included. So your cycle time is essentially from the time they get in the truck until they get back in the truck again. So it's usually a little longer than we think. We calculate a 2-hour cycle time and forget about the break. Probably needs to be 2.5 hours, or at least 2 hours and 15 minutes. That's the real cycle time. The pavement type makes a difference. The materials, the traffic can make a difference, okay? So these are all things. So again, we're gonna let you put on here, currently, what do you have right now for your application rates? You just use a standard for your whole system. You already have a system in place to deal with participation type. You calculate it based on route length, use air temperature, use pavement temperature, you use time of day, and do you have weather forecasting in your system? I'm hoping most of you put that in. One of the things that PolEV does, which I've never quite understood, is they don't give me the percentage of people who gave me the answer. They give me a percentage of the overall, which if you can do multiple, it should be all, but I have a way to see how many people are doing this. So most of you are clicking weather forecast, which is good, okay? Most of you are doing participation type and intensity, which is critical, okay? I'm glad to see it's not just standard application rates. That's what we did for many, many years, okay? But you may want to think about your route length, your cycle time. You may want to think about pavement temperature, or at least figure out ways to get that. And of course, traffic and time of day make a huge difference, because you may need to have a little bit more early in the day when it's still cold. And you may want to have a little bit more when there's more traffic, or a little less when there's more traffic. Again, depending on your conditions, whether people can get speed or not, and what hills you've got. Certainly around here in Ithaca, if they get trapped and you can't get up and down the hills, traffic stops, and now all of a sudden, all of those calculations, traffic's going to help us, go out the window, okay? So these are all things, hopefully, you've included in your system. Now, let's talk a little bit about some emergencies, some things that change the plan. We have a policy. The policy is assuming everything is working, okay? So let's talk about a couple of policies. One of the first ones that we're going to deal with is crashes. Do you have a policy for what happens if a crash occurs? So raise your hand if you have a policy for what happens when a crash occurs on your system, whether it's during the day and you're at the site or at night. What do you do for call-offs? Do you have a policy for that? You send one truck, two trucks, small truck, big truck? What do you do? Every one of you should have a policy in place. What is the rule in place? Do you have somebody as the go-to person that public safety calls and says, hey, we had a crash occur on Main Street or on Jones Road. We need to send somebody out. We got the fire trucks concerned about safety. We got school buses that are trapped. Do you need to call 911? Okay, so think about a policy. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can actually be something starting in your head, but think about it and just some simple steps to remind you to call 911. Two, make sure you've got the right materials available. Do you need a big truck or a little truck? Okay. You're dealing with major storms. Now, y'all mentioned this earlier, the two major storms that most of us fear a little bit, and that's okay. Fear is not a problem. We can overcome that. But if there's danger, we really want to make sure to deal with that. Or blizzards and ice storms, okay? With a blizzard, it's quantity and it's the wind, and trying to keep things open can be very, very dangerous. Hopefully that's when you're talking about shutting things down and limiting where people are driving. One thing I know a lot of agencies do, which I think is a good idea, is when the storms get big enough, they actually will assign a plow to work with emergency management, whether it's the ambulance or the fire, and they work together to get people from point A to point B rather than trying to fight the storm. Maybe keep the main roads open, but have plows on standby to work with the fire equipment to get into a site, or an ambulance to get into a site. Okay. And then the other one is ice storms. And if you've experienced an ice storm, raise your hand. How many of you have experienced an ice storm? Raise your hand there. I'm hoping it's only a couple of you. Oh, I was afraid that. Out of the 50 of you that are on here, actually it's smaller than I thought it would be. That's good. So about a fifth of you have experienced an ice storm. I went through more than a few. I went through one as a kid and one when I worked over in Yates County that were major ice storms. We're talking 1 or 2 inches of ice or more. Those can change things completely because trees come down, power lines come down, everything gets frozen up. Okay, So do you have generators for that? What do you do about your crews? What do you do about their families? These are all things you need to be thinking about in part of your winter snow and ice policy, okay? Now, in terms of specialized equipment, do you have a big snow go for really big storms? Do you have some V piles that maybe you only bring out for the blizzards? Do you have that snow fence to help deal with drifting and things like that? Okay. So what kind of specialized equipment in the Q&A, put in there, what kind of specialized equipment do you have? Let's see what you guys have. And I'll read it back to people and see what they've got. Nobody's got anything specialized? I know somebody's going to have something. They've got a grader with a wing, like you see in the picture. Yeah, that you pull out. A 2-stage snowplow, a big snow blower. Okay. A brine maker. Yeah, people have got their own brine makers. That's a good way to do it. A tow plow. Yeah. Those are really pretty cool. They work really well if the balance is right. If you don't get too much weight on one or the other and you just lower the weight some. You got blowers for your loaders. Yep. My advice to you, if you've got a special piece of equipment that doesn't get used every single year, like a snow go, like the blower you see there on the left, I don't care what has happened that year, get the equipment running. Don't wait until that storm is occurring. Get it running every single year. Make sure it's working in good shape, that you can hook it up. People know how to hook it up. And it's good practice, maybe even in the winter, to check and make sure you can do that in an emergency, in a pinch. That you've got all the parts, that somebody hasn't moved a chain that you need to actually hook things together, or a cable. Okay, so every year, everything you've got, fire it up at least once and make sure it's working. Change the oil out if it needs it and things like that. Okay. Now, in terms of shared services, we have 2 types of shared services. Well, 3 really. One is we have a contract. This particular case, you can actually see a county loader is filling a state plow. That's actually done in this particular one. It was actually being done via a contract. It was actually a shared service policy. The single pile was used for both the state and county roads, and they pulled from it. Okay, so we have contract documents that we deal with. We can have handshake agreements where we help each other out, and then we have emergencies where something happens. Your plow breaks down, you're down truck. Your loader breaks down, you have no way to load your equipment. You don't get that salt delivery that you've been expecting, and now you're out of salt. So you really need to be thinking about having in your plans the contracts, yes, these handwritten handshake agreements that we may want to think about putting at least down as agreements, not maybe a formal contract. But what happens if? What happens when that emergency occurs? Do you have a plan in place to work with your fellow communities? We all do that really well around the state, but now is the time to be thinking about that. What's your backup plan? I'm going to ask another question, raising your hand. How many of you have had a highway garage, not your own necessarily, but a highway garage in your area? Could be your own county, it could just be nearby, that you know is burned down in the last 5 years. They've lost equipment, they've lost buildings, they've had damage, and now they're in trouble. Only a few of you, that's good. We estimate statewide 5 to 10 highway garages are destroyed every year, mostly due to fires. We've seen a few floods, but fires are by far the biggest issue. Even with cutoff switches, it doesn't always work because sometimes they put specialized equipment on there and they bypass the cutoff switch. You might want to check for that, by the way. But yeah, this happens more often than you'd like. So having a plan in place is pretty important. So of course, this leads everything to, do you have a snow and ice control policy? And is it really broad enough? Don't go crazy. I'm not a fan of huge snow and ice control policies, okay? You can go nuts. But I am a fan of having something that you think about all the processes to deal with everything from the blizzards and the ice storms to just the standard everyday activities. So I'm going to ask you, why do you think a written policy is recommended? Why is that really a good idea? Why is that a really good idea? Consistency, yeah. So everyone knows the same thing. It's a communication tool, yeah. Cover your butt. Yeah, there's some liability. I'm on my list of things I want to make sure we covered is the fact that tort liability is minimized. It actually reduces your tort liability. Yep. Standardization. Yep. Everybody's on the same page. Okay. You inform the public of your plans, so everybody's on the same page, and the public knows what's going on because people change and retire. I know Bill Lupian will be here long after all of us are all gone. So he's an exception, but everybody else does retire after a while. And when that happens, it's nice to have that consistency between things. Okay. There may be some legal issues, especially if you're sharing services. I got a couple of others that we don't always think about that I think are really critical that I would add to your reason. It forces you to plan ahead. We tend to want to, oh, I got snow and ice. Oh, that's 3 months from now. Snow's not coming anytime soon. But now's the time to be thinking about it. Having a written policy forces us to do that, even if it's a short, simple one. It's a great PR tool. We mentioned that. It actually leads to a higher level of service because you're more efficient. You've got things where you need them, you get better pricing. Okay. And in terms of training your staff and even training the public, you can actually use this as part of your training procedures. In fact, I would write my policy around the idea of what is I need to do my job well, and what do I need to make sure the crew understands how to have all of us working together. Now we have on our website, you can just search, by the way, you don't have to go crazy for this, a winter maintenance plan that you can actually download and use as a starting point. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just go online and go and click on winter maintenance plan, the search winter maintenance plan. And Amanda may catch up with me, and I forgot to tell her about this ahead of time. It may show up in the chat pod before we get done. It's a pretty cool little plan to get you started. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and don't go crazy. Don't make it super long. It's not worth it. Okay. So now what we're going to do, we're at 9:51, and my plan had been to be a little bit short. I figured we'd give you a 55-minute one to end the summer series. So let's do our PDH questions, and let's talk about this. Which is not a factor in determining your chemical application rate? So if you're putting down chemical, which one of these is not, surprisingly, is not critical? Let's see what people say. Okay. So let's just ask this. Type of precipitation, if it's ice versus snow versus wet snow versus just sleet, yeah, that's going to affect things. So it's not bad. Route cycle time obviously is going to make a difference because how much material we have to put down may vary on how long it takes to get back there. Pavement temperature I've mentioned several times. So yeah, you got it right. Air temperature, surprisingly, is not as the critical factor. Though, of course, air temperature does eventually affect pavement temperature. And if that's all we've got, we have to use it. So if you don't have a way to measure pavement temperature, try to think about how the air temperature relates. But realize that if the pavement temperature gets below freezing and the air temperature is above freezing, that leads to black ice. And so that is one thing where you want to be thinking about. Pavement temperature is the key, but it can be related to air temperature in a couple of exceptions. Okay, so pretty good. Good job. Stopping distance is shortest on which surface? Soft loose snow, a slushy road with no bonded ice, snowpack, ice, or none of the above. Shortest, not the longest, shortest. Okay, in other words, if I put on the brakes, I stop fastest. So you can unclick and redo it if you want to. Which one of these is going to be? Okay. Somebody put down none of the above. If you do none of the above, I need you to tell me what you think that is going to be. I only gave you 4 choices. Of those 4 choices, the answer, by the way, is pretty much B and C aren't that far apart from each other. Okay. And for the sneaky people who put down E, you haven't put in the Q&A there. You could sneak in there, put none of the above, and type in dry road. But think about the fact that as ice forms, obviously it's going to get longer distances, and we want to be aware of that. Okay. So a slushy road with no bonded ice or soft loose snow can actually get pretty slippery. But slushy road with no bonded ice would be my first choice. Snowpack would be second. Soft loose snow depends on the type of snow, actually. So, okay. So now, a bare road policy is always recommended for high volume roads. What do you think? Bare road policy. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not a fan of a bare road policy, to be totally honest with you. I'm not saying there aren't those policies, and I'm not saying that we don't want to have that as a goal, much in the same way that for traffic safety, our goal should always be 0 deaths. That should be our goal. But we have to be realistic about the fact that there will be times when we can't keep that road bare for some period. So we have to communicate that to the public and say, look, even though it's a main road and it's a high volume road, we could make it bare, but to do so would cost so much more money and actually do damage in terms of the environment. And there are things we can do if people are willing to slow down. So a bare road policy is really risky because it then gets into the idea that we think every road can be bare. And we pour tons of salt down, and we pour tons of price and equipment and money, and we don't really get a return on that particular investment. But if you have a policy, try to stick to it. Now, I see Amanda has caught up in the chat pod. She put in a couple of sample snow policies that are available on our website via the box. If for some reason you can't access it, just send us an email, and I'll show you that in the last slide here. We are doing a full day class. So it's 6 hours of contact time to do a lot more detail about what we've talked about here today. I just want to give you an overview, things that you need to be thinking about now. But we are going to be doing snow and ice in Wyoming, Chemung, St. Lawrence, Fulton, Westchester, and Delaware counties in September, October, and November. And if we're not near you, you could request it. We might be able to bring that workshop out to you. And as a final reminder, we are doing these Y webinars starting up again after the bridge conference, excuse me, not Highway School Bridge Conference. And yeah, some of them will actually be next summer as well. So look for that. And we hope you have fun. I hope you have a great fall. We want to see you in some of our workshops, not just snow and ice, or maybe see you at the county, town, or NICOM meetings this fall. With that, everybody have yourself a great rest of the summer, great fall. See you on the road. And again, have any questions, go to our website. Just search for us, NYSLTAP, Cornell Local Roads, so the one that's on screen, or send us an email with any questions, clrp@cornell.edu. With that, have a great day, be kind, stay well, stay safe.